So I am absolutely delighted today to introduce Jason Ananda Josephson Storm. I have only the most positive words to say about him. I had the very good fortune of meeting him in Helsinki and then in Vilnius, and we got to share a meal together. And which is interesting, I've been a follower of his work for quite some time. And if there is one thinker who's involved in religious studies, who's trying to help us break out of a lot of the assumptions that we made, it is the man of the hour. And I would encourage all of you to read his book, The Myth of Disenchantment. And he also is sort of like me in a way. He's someone who doesn't really buy the whole East-West divide and learn Japanese, which I think is always a very good thing for engaging the sources. So, yes, and now you're at what's the name of your university?
At the moment, I'm at Williams College,
Williams College. And that's in Western New York,
Western Massachusetts. Yeah.
Western Massachusetts. Okay. Yeah, I couldn't remember one of those. Yeah, so we are super excited to have you. I've been looking forward to this all week.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm psyched to talk to you all. Let me share my screen or share my PowerPoint. Okay, can you see that? Is everybody good with that? Okay. Glimmering Gods of the Electric Age, Thomas Edison's Japanese Apotheosis and the Extraordinary History of the Lightbulb. Part 1. On June 1st, 1949, the Japanese government officially recognized a new religion with the name Den Shinkyo, Religion of the Electric Gods. It had been founded by an Osaka-based dealer in electrical appliances. So, as you might tell from its name, the new faith worshipped electricity, which they personified as Tenshi Denki Okami, the great god or great kami of heaven, earth, and electricity or lightning. For those non-specialists accustomed to regarding Shinto as an archaic or animistic religion, this already might come across as an oddity. But even scholars who lack those presuppositions will likely find surprising one of the features of this movement, which is that among their deities, included in the official pantheon, was none other than a god named Ejisan no Mikoto, Thomas Edison, whose name has been rendered in a kind of phonetic play on his surname as the august, glimmering, magnetic, divine Lord. Insofar as scholars have commented on this strange new religion, they have typically dismissed it as a strange byproduct of a 1945 Japanese law code that granted tax exemptions to religions without codifying exactly how a religion was defined. But the religion of the electric gods, as this talk will show, was no mere tax fraud. Its origins predate 1945, and Edison was already being worshipped as a living god in Japan in 1928, and the dedicatory plaque, I've translated here, hopefully you can see this. Oh, my own screen is slightly making it hard for me to see, but I will hide thumbnails. Well, okay. Nope, sorry. Back. No. Okay. Well, anyway, here's the plaque. Since the creation of the universe, wondrous electricity, hidden, unseen, and weightless, yet it becomes a force, light and substance. It freely alters all things, making even our earth a giant magnet. All animals and plants receive the blessings of electricity, which nourishes and nurtures everything in the origin of cosmic yin and yang. Everything in the universe inevitably involves the workings of electricity. In other words, electricity is the action of an actual deity revealed by science, and here revered as the god of heaven, earth, and electricity. We also worship as guardian of the new realm the spirit of the visionary Thomas Edison, who summoned forth almighty electricity. Okay, that's pretty unusual. That's 1929. And if that were all, we might just think of it as a couple of Osaka-based eccentrics. But let me provide a few more examples before we try and explain the oddity of this pattern. Even today, in the foothills of the Arashiyama Mountains, on the western outskirts of Kyoto, Japan, are famous to even Japanese sightseers who make their way to the region for its famous bamboo groves, medieval temples, and seasonal cherry blossoms. But nestled among these quaint tourist attractions sits a very unusual Shinto shrine, the Den-den-gu Shrine, dedicated to Den-den Myojin, the bright god of electric light and electromagnetic waves. A deity, from its title alone, might seem to occupy a vexed position among religion, science, and technology. Every year on the 23rd of May, a group of men and women in formal attire descend on the shrine for a festival in reverence to this god. Typically, most of them gather under the covered awning in front of a, quote, radio tower stupa, end quote, which is dedicated to incarnations of the bright god. What these disparate individuals share is that most work in the consumer electronics industry, or the electrical power industry, or in broadcast media. The yearly ritual includes Buddhist sutras chanted by Shingon sect priests from the adjoining Horinji temple. The head priest also leads the congregation in lighting incense and leaving flower offerings to various incarnations of the bright god. In a short set of prepared remarks, a representative of the Kyoto Broadcasting Systems Company memorializes the techno-scientific deity, thanks it for its inspirations, and asks for its blessing for the coming year. When I went there in 2015, various protective talismans blessed by the bright god were available for the purchase in the shrine shop, including laptop stickers, cell phone decorations, micro SD cards, all of which were touted for their ability to prevent computer viruses, power surges, maintain the safety of electric cars, or otherwise facilitate the functioning of electrical technologies. When I asked the shrine priest what made it unique, one of the priests who worked there, he said that it was founded on the idea that electricity is not a human creation, but a divine blessing. Megumi is the word for blessing that he used. Although the shrine complex itself officially dates all the way back to the 9th century, when it was originally focused on a god of lightning, there is a contemporary twist, because in 1956, the director of the Kinki Bureau of Telecommunications, a man by the name of Hirabayashi Kinosuke, had a vision that the bright god was no mere lightning deity, but was associated with electricity in general and had possessed an additional human incarnation, the American inventor Thomas Alva Edison. Even today, part of the appeal of the shrine is a dedicatory Buddha stupa with an informational plaque that explains that the shrine guards the soul, Tama, of Thomas Edison as one of the deity's incarnations, revealing his true identity as Denki Soshin, the divine patriarch of electricity. Okay, this might sound like an idiosyncratic rebranding of an old shrine, but it's not even the only shrine in the area dedicated to Thomas Edison. About 20 kilometers to the south of Arashiyama, at Iwashi Mizo Hachimangu Shrine on the mountain of Otokoyama, a different dedicatory plaque exists to Edison, and it has stood in place since 1934. It states, "Who can deny the grace of the Hachiman gods in Edison's undertaking? There are no cities in the world where electric lamps are not lighted. Thus, electric lights proclaim to the world the divine virtues of the great god Hachiman." The theology of the Iwashi Mizo Hachimangu Shrine is slightly different insofar as it basically jointly attributes electrification to Edison and the shrine's traditional deity of Hachiman, but the shrine also distributes special prayer plaques with Edison's visage on them. And the prayer plaque says, has Edison on one side, and then it says a Japanese translation of 90% perspiration, 1% inspiration, and a picture of a light bulb on the other side. And it's using a term for inspiration that might suggest divine spark. So the main task of this talk will be to address several entangled issues. First, how did Edison become a Japanese deity? Second, what does this hybrid figure, Shinto Buddhist, Japanese American, archaic contemporary, religious scientific, tell us about the relationship between deification and rationality? This is a fine point I'll return to in a second, hence the asterisk. How does the cultural history of electrification undercut classical theories of modernization as the end of animism? To explain this point, classical theories of modernization have often assumed that as civilizations get more advanced or more modern, they eventually get rid of beliefs in a vibrant cosmos of spirits and animating beings and invest instead in a clockwork, mechanical universe of dead and insensate matter. People have talked about this in different terms. Sometimes they describe it as disenchantment, but sometimes they portray it in terms of the departure of primitive animism and the arrival of scientific or technological civilization. The main idea is that it has often been assumed that as modernity reaches fruition, spirits vanish and they're displaced by a world of controllable machines and technological artifacts. As I argued in The Myth of Disenchantment, a version of this narrative about magic is wrong, but I want to push against it here in terms of its philosophy of technology. Insofar as the story of modernization has been spatialized, it has often been described as something that happened in the West, but not necessarily in Asia. Indeed, a common Orientalist trope is to suppose that there's an opposition between a spiritual or mystic Orient and a materialist, modern, technological, rational Occident. Here, belief in animism is seen as an abyssal line separating East and West. Although scholars today are wary of describing Asia in such terms, one has only to walk into most bookstores to find popular versions of this theme, and I often hear it from my undergrads. Finally, I want to use this talk to tell us a little bit about how science and religion are constructed as global categories. To explain this last, oh, yeah, sorry. I'll jump back to that point in a minute. Okay. To return to this issue over deification and rationality, I want to start with another famous deification, apotheosis. In 1779, Captain James Cook arrived in the Hawaiian Islands during a festival for a local deity called Lono. According to some accounts, the indigenous Hawaiians worshiped the British explorer as a god, but when he became increasingly belligerent and threatened to kidnap their king, they killed him. According to some, they nonetheless deified him. Interpretations of this event have been controversial, and in the 1990s, two famous anthropologists, Marshall Solins on one side of your screen and Gayanath Obaseka, threw down around the question of whether Cook had actually been worshipped as a god. According to Solins, Cook was deified, but this showed that indigenous peoples had non-rational ways of knowing. Rationality in this account is cultural. Obaseka differed, and he said that quote, I doubt that natives created their European god. Europeans created him for them. This European god is a myth, end quote. Obaseka argued that indigenous Hawaiians were, quote unquote, practically rational, which he suggested was incompatible with deification. So he said they couldn't have deified anyone because they were practical, rational people. And although this may seem like an old debate with little purchase, versions of this question about the Eurocentrism of rationality continually return in different disciplines. But I won't tell you about them because this is academic infighting. So I want to challenge this. And I want to tell you also, I flipped those two slides, sorry, but talk about how this locates in my work. Del already mentioned The Myth of Disenchantment. For a while, I've been working around the questions of how the categories religion, science, and superstition/magic were defined over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, and globalized, how they were early articulated in Europe and then came to be differentiated and imposed elsewhere. And this talk, I can say a lot more details about this, but what I want to say is I'm not taking for granted these categories. I'm interested in how these categories were constructed and negotiated by different peoples, both in Europe and Asia and elsewhere. And so I've got a couple other books after this that are on philosophical topics, but I'm returning to Japan to address this issue in what I'm presenting to you now. To do so, I want to give you, and this is the weird thing, this talk is really in certain ways just a story about the light bulb, which sounds a little bit bonkers, but this is actually to answer the question of how Edison became a Japanese god. I need to tell you an extraordinary history of the light bulb. Histories of the light bulb are usually told in terms of a kind of progressive rise of scientific rationalism and increasing invention. But to foreshadow, explaining Edison's apotheosis will not only explore the history of this ordinary object, the light bulb. I have one just outside of frame, but I'll have to, well, I could tip it in as a prop, but you know what I'm talking about. And In order to do so, I have to contract a complex cultural history of electricity, a history that lies behind the simple Edison bulb, a history that includes everything from a ghost machine to a god of warriors, from investors and capitalists to Shinto medicine, from revolutionary samurai turned politicians to theosophical seekers after ancient wisdom, and which ultimately takes us to the depths of Atlantis and the transcendent heights of the ninth dimension of the spiritual world, at least in the eyes of some of the characters I'll be talking about. In so doing, we will trouble many a received narrative about modernity, animism, and the putative relationship between religion and science. Okay, here we go. Here's the conventional story. The conventional story of the light bulb is that in 1878, the young inventor Thomas Edison was invited to a Connecticut factory by an engineer named William Wallace, who had installed a set of newly designed electrical arc lights. Arc lights were then fairly new technologically. They were capable of providing a dazzling radiance that could illuminate large areas, but they basically flickered like a strobe, and Wallace's prototype required each to be powered by a massive dynamo, which made them difficult to scale. Edison was at that time looking for a new project, having recently completed his work on the phonograph and telegraph to much public acclaim. So, according to one journalistic eyewitness, Edison was, quote, enraptured, unquote, by the lights, and he rushed around making a set of calculations before turning to his companion and saying, quote, I believe I can beat you in making the electric light, end quote. A month later, Edison was reporting to the New York Sun newspaper that after only a couple of nights tinkering in his home lab, he had already, quote, discovered the necessary secret, end quote, and would soon be bringing an affordable light bulb to the public market. This statement was taken sufficiently seriously that it caused a run on gas stocks in both the United States and Europe, and it helped to secure Edison funding from the likes of J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilts. But in many respects, Edison was bluffing. He had not actually discovered the secret of the electric lighting. A central problem remained unsolved, namely finding a good material for the wick. He had been trying platinum, which worked well enough, but was way too expensive for a consumer artifact. Moreover, he wasn't alone in the search for the functioning incandescent light bulb, but he had many competitors in the United States and a big rival in England in the form of the English physicist Sir Joseph Swan. Swan was already a step ahead of the Americans, having demonstrated a working light bulb in 1879 that used a filament made from carbonized paper. So in July 1880, 2 years after Edison had already said the problem was solved, he had little to show for his work. His creditors were getting anxious, and the press had turned critical. So Edison made up his mind to switch, following Swan, to focus on carbon filaments. But he knew that the specific filaments Swan was using didn't work. They weren't quite good enough. So he sent agents scouring across the globe to find the perfect filament. According to the traditional story, his assistant, William H. Moore, found a particular variety of bamboo, Phylostachys bambusiotis, the fibers of which provided the ideal filament for a light bulb. For tech geeks, I can say a lot more about the engineering challenges he had to solve, but I'm going to skip those because I've already rambled a little bit. But this breakthrough meant that Edison was able to begin to successfully manufacture bulbs by the end of that year that vastly outperformed his rivals. And then the following year, he was able to put bulbs into a larger electrical lighting system he had designed, and the so-called War of Currents was launched. To be sure, Edison's real chops were in his financial backing and his lawyer's skill with deploying patents. And they were much more crucial than the legend lets on. Here's a depiction of the patent office of his patents. Edison's really, many scholars have recognized that Edison's most important insight was not the specific wick material, but how to automate the discovery process. Basically, he managed to get a bunch of assistants in parallel to undertake the same kind of research and testing efforts, matching the efficiency of one of Henry Ford's assembly lines, which is no accident because Ford was inspired by Edison in his development of assembly line manufacturing. So in effect, Edison's Menlo Park laboratory was a key step on the way to what's called big science or techno science, which is to say science on an industrial scale. But on a technological note, the bamboo filaments that Edison's team discovered did work better than the alternatives because they were thinner and required less electricity to produce light and lasted longer. So it worked. Okay. So far, so good. But there are two key things that conventional historiography admits. William Moore can't claim sole credit for the discovery, as the bamboo he introduced to Edison was suggested to him by someone in Japan. And it wasn't any old plant, but a particular subspecies of bamboo, and it even that grew on the precincts of the shrine of a Japanese god, the so-called tutelary god of warriors, Hachiman. So the next section will provide some background on this strange god, which is one of the two supposedly Shinto deities that later became entangled with Thomas Edison. And then it will foreground forgotten Japanese. I found the dude who recommended the bamboo from that shrine to Edison's assistant, and we're going to reveal who he was. Part two, the bamboo the bamboo arrows of Hachiman. In 1868, Japan had just undergone a revolution, officially known as the Meiji Restoration. And it is perhaps surprising that one of the very first acts of a new government was a curious proclamation. Henceforth, the title Hachiman Great Bodhisattva is not to be used. Instead, the title Hachiman Great God, Hachiman Okami, is to be adopted instead. This brief line, a substitution of one noun for another, is a microcosm of one of the crucial Japanese ideological struggles in the last half of the 19th century. Really briefly, the Japanese leadership were trying to separate gods from Buddhas and fracture Shinto from Buddhism. In effect, they ended up producing an autonomous Shinto as an invented tradition. Not that it came out of nowhere, but that it had been entangled with Buddhism for most of its previous history. And this put it on its own footing in a new way. This was also a symbolic disrobing of the god Hachiman, because in the period immediately before this edict, Hachiman was then regularly depicted in statues as a robed Buddhist monk, and these statues were basically banned, or at least taken out of shrines, to reveal his supposedly original Shinto nature, thus constructing an imperial Shinto separate from Buddhism. Right, there's Hachiman in his Buddhist form. In this context, Hachiman was identified as a bodhisattva. The narrative that we have, and I'll skip through this, but I'd love to go back and tell you more details if anyone is curious. But basically, from the very first records of the deity Hachiman, we don't know what his name means. It's written in characters that mean 8 flags, but it's probably phonetic for something that is either Korean or a non-Japanese language. But he was already associated from the very beginning with Buddhism, and he was described in early works as a local Japanese god who had converted to Buddhism. So he had become a monk after having encountered the preaching of the Dharma, and he had taken on the title Daiji Zai O Bosatsu, the great self-existing bodhisattva. Bodhisattvas were kind of Buddhas to be. Daiji Zai is also interesting because it seems to have been taken from the Japanese name Daiji Zai Ten, which is the Japanese name for the so-called Hindu deity Maheshvara, often identified with Shiva. So in essence, Hachiman was either Shiva converted to Buddhism, or a local god converted to Buddhism, or some kind of transposed deity that had been turned Buddhist, but had somewhat of an identity preserved from Buddhism. This is how he's recorded in early texts, basically from the 8th and 9th centuries. But before long, he had also had a human incarnation. According to a text that we have different fragments of it that date probably from about 1301 or 1304, called the Hachiman Gudokun. Hachiman explained to young people. It's like Hachiman for kids, but it's not really for kids. It's for like novices and initiates. But it was a text explaining the history of the shrine to novices. According to that shrine, there had been an important revelation many years earlier. A blacksmith here's my translation of the text. It's a little raw, but Oga no Higi was an unusual man who for 3 years lived like a mountain recluse, abstaining from the five grains. In the first month of 571, he was praying to Hachiman, and he saw a kind of hawk, a goshawk, descend and transform itself into a 3-year-old child standing on a bamboo leaf. The deity said, I was also, or I was once, the Emperor Ojin, the 16th sovereign of Japan. My true title is the kingdom protecting, wonder working, divinely powerful Bodhisattva. And then the little child vanishes. A shrine, Hachiman Shrine, is built on that location, Iwashimizu. There it is on the map. After that, supposedly in 859, although we can doubt its historicity somewhat. We also doubt the historicity of Emperor Ojin, who, although basically was a name on a lineage chart, we know next to nothing about in actual historical texts. But there was this temple that was built on this site and associated with Hachiman. That temple was the Iwashimizu Hachiman Shrine that was both patronized by the imperial family and by Buddhist and what would later become Shinto priests. And it is the bamboo of that very shrine that was harvested to serve as the Edison bulb filaments. How did that happen? Well, partially in the intermediary time in the 19th century, starting the 18th and building into the 19th century, Shinto is being invented in Japan as something different from Buddhism, as I said, but it is being done so already in dialogue with what the Japanese know of Western science. I've written about this in some detail in my first book. I won't go into all the details here, but the short version of the story is that Japan was in a period of isolation where it was basically closed to foreign commerce, but it allowed certain imported works from the Netherlands or from China if they were stripped of their Christian references, because it was worried about Christian incursions or conversion. And so they took and they imported works, and then the Japanese censors literally blacked out the references to God or anything they thought smacked of God or Christianity, and they were pretty liberal with their blacking out. They didn't know that Christianity, Islam, Judaism were separate religions. They also, for some reason, thought Euclid had something to do with the Christianity, and they blacked out the names of various secular religious missionaries and other random folks. But what it meant is that the Japanese were importing secularized European natural philosophy when it didn't exist in Europe. The other thing that it flips is that then the Japanese started plugging in these invented Shinto deities into that formula later. So Japanese folks had already said in 1765, electricity, they're sort of garbling their sources, but electricity is the name of a man who devised and perfected an apparatus for extracting inner fire. Everyone knows that long ago, when the Buddha entered nirvana under the Bodhi tree, electrical fire shot out of his body. Later, the art of medicine, although introduced to Japan from abroad, appears originally to have been taught to foreign countries by our own gods, according to Hirata Tsutane. Later, the major and minor universal laws are as follows: the laws of the god Ubasuna's creation of the universe, the principles of astronomy, and the rules of the calendrical system. This is an astronomical work from the 1825 Japan by a guy named Sato Nobuhiro. Finally, Western science should be regarded as the specific bequest or gift of the god Sukuna Hikona, a very influential Shinto thinker named Okuni Takamasa in 1853. All that is to say, when the revolution happened, there was already something in place to assimilate science and Shinto. Now we're finally at the dude who provided the bamboo, a guy named Makimura Masanao. To provide a short biographical sketch, Makimura Masanao was born in 1834 in a minor samurai family in southwestern Japan. As a young man, he was a key player in the Meiji Restoration, or Japanese Revolution. He and his fellow samurai allies worked to overthrow the ruling Tokugawa shogunate and usher in a new era. He was not a major figure in the fighting, but he was friends with several of the people who became big players in the government that followed. The early ideology of the new government suggested that it would both return to the divine age, when the gods were present and walked with men, and capture and achieve scientific and technological modernity. So it was both scientific and Shinto at once. After the revolution, Makimura built a career as a local politician in Kyoto, where eventually he became a prefectural governor. which was his role when one of Edison's assistants arrived in Japan looking for new materials in 1880. That's William Moore, the man who's normally credited with the discovery. But Moore had been sent to Makimura in particular by one of Edison's contacts in Japan, a man named Ito Hirobumi, a Japanese politician who had studied in London and who knew and was part of the same faction of the government as Makimura. Makimura's policies as a Kyoto regional official were consistently pro-Shinto and pro-modernization. I can give you some attitudes, but in general, he was basically trying to celebrate local industry and local shrines. From his diaries, it also seems that Makimura was a devotee of Hachiman, or at least he made public pilgrimages. Like, he's a politician, so you can't know what he innerly feels, and his diaries were written for public consumption, probably, his memoirs, basically. But he at least made pilgrimages to the Hachiman shrine at one key point before a major battle in the revolution. And this is perhaps why Makimura knew about that shrine and directed Moore to it. But even more specifically, one key thing that he knew is that the shrine had been used to make special bamboo arrows that were used to in rituals to ward off demons. They were exorcism arrows from bamboo. And the shrine had a well-established industry in producing and distributing bamboo for commercial consumption in the forms of exorcism arrows. This was something Makimura knew because he had been to that shrine. We should also note that later folks in Japan, even after electricity came out, endorsed this synergy between technological modernity and the gods. For instance, Ida Takesato, a Shinto priest and professor of Japanese classics at Tokyo Imperial University, wrote an essay shortly after Edison's electrification phenomena called Denki To, of the electric lamp, in which he provided a Shinto explanation and rationale for electrical power. He remarked, quote, and here the quote is, "The people of the West, being industrious in everything, developed a way to replace the oil lamp by assembling light and manufacturing this into a marvelous apparatus that we may even call a small sun. Nevertheless, as might be suspected, their people have not the faintest idea that in the light bulb's very filament there exists the blood of the fire deity Kagatsuchi. Do they not know that the electric lamp hinges on the fire deity's august deeds?" There isn't space to get into the intricacies of his text, but basically he argues that light bulbs are effectively a miracle that function to witness the supremacy of the Japanese gods. And this was not unique to Ida. A number of Japanese thinkers from the period argued that Euro-American science really was powered by Japanese deities. Ida's peers often thought that they had Edison partially to thank for that. As it happened, Edison's birthday also happened to fall on February 11th, which is the same day in the Gregorian calendar associated with the founding of Japan by the legendary Emperor Jimmu. Accordingly, Iwashimizu Hachimangu Shrine celebrates February 11th each year with a ceremony commemorating the birth of Japan, and then a separate ritual honoring the birth of Thomas Edison. All this contributed to a double apotheosis of Edison because he's in two sites in Kyoto, the Iwashimizu Hachimangu Shrine, and where he's celebrated as an important figure, if not quite a god, and the Dendengu Shrine, where we began, or the first shrine location that we began with. Makimura and his peers also saw the production of a pipeline between Japanese bamboo harvesting and Edison's light bulbs as a way to help Japan economically. As it happened, these connections facilitated the travels of Japanese inventors to the United States to work with Edison. Two such inventors were Iwadare Kunihiko and Fujioka Ichisuke, who went to Edison, and then they came back and they established the Japanese company NEC, which is still with us today, and the consumer electronics giant Toshiba, respectively. Both companies played vital roles in the Japanese electronics industry, especially after World War II. Edison's success, therefore, came increasingly to symbolize technoscientific success in Japan because the two were entangled, and his later deification was used to celebrate and indigenize the country's electronics industry. And even today, NEC and Toshiba seem to be, as far as I could tell from looking at the donations to the shrine, two of Dendengu Shrine's main financial contributors. So in praising Edison's apotheosis, the shrine functions as a way to boost the local telecommunications industry. To be clear, I don't want to reinforce false notions of an essential opposition between Shinto and economics, religion and science, or animism and modernization. Perhaps one of the main reasons that Makimura picked the Iwashimizu Hachimango shrine that it was already a business. Indeed, before a revised Japanese law code later in the 19th century that distinguished religious practice from commercial practices, Iwashimizu had not only sold the bamboo arrows, but they had been involved in trade. In the medieval period, there was even a guild based out of the shrine focused on selling fish and oil. So, and before the restoration, the shrine priests traded in, this is a list I got from a record, silk, cotton, cloth dyeing, fresh produce, indigo, cakes, medicine, sesame, and salt, in addition to bamboo. So, and they leased out farmlands for cultivation, and they served as money changers. So bamboo was diversification for an institution with a long history in commerce, as well as the celebration of particular deities. But it might seem that I've reinforced a split between an animate East and a technological West. And it is here that I need to move to part 3, Edison's ghost machine. On a dark winter's night in 1920, Thomas Edison assembled a group of scientists and engineers in his laboratory to test a most unusual invention. The lights were dimmed, and Edison fired up a machine he had been working on for more than a decade. It flickered to life, bathing the room in a feeble electrical glow. Its activity coincided with that of an amplifier intended to capture the subtlest of sounds. The purpose of the machine was to discover haunting spirits. The press would later dub this device Edison's ghost machine. I'll return to this machine and how it fit into Edison's project in a moment, but first I want to talk about why it's a surprise, maybe. Today in the United States, Edison's reputation as an inventor persists in the popular imagination. He appears in elementary school textbooks and seemed to be a paragon of secular and or common sense rationality. Even today, the cliche of a light bulb appearing over a character's head is often seen to symbolize a stroke of genius or flash of inspiration. As I've argued elsewhere, the putative opposition between seance and science is largely anachronistic, but one reason that Edison's own spiritualistic research never became fully common currency is that it was suppressed, not in his own lifetime, but later. Strikingly, Edison himself was open about this research and his own unique theological beliefs, and he discussed them at length in the first printing of his posthumously published diary, the Diary and Sundry Observations of Thomas Alva Edison. But his heirs intervened after the very first printing, not the first edition, the first printing, and they had these expunged and all unsold copies destroyed of this printing destroyed. Fortunately, a handful of libraries in the US had already purchased copies, hence I was able to get a hold of the rare lost chapter in which Edison lays out what amounts to his own spiritual beliefs, paranormal research, and even occult interests. The first thing to note is that he was explicit about his attempts to develop a scientific instrument capable of verifying the existence of the survival of the personality after death. As he put it, quote, "If we can evolve an instrument so delicate as to be affected or moved or manipulated by our personality as it survives in the next life, such an instrument, when made available, ought to record something significant." In this respect, he was aiming to provide paranormal researchers with a key technology to prove the existence of ghosts. He thought that if anyone could do it, it would be him and his laboratory. But while he claimed that he had some tantalizing results, he never claimed that he had been able to do so. It was made an unfinished project. The ontology behind his machine is particularly fascinating because it offers a fascinating case in point. Some contemporary scholars have argued that we should encourage people to believe in vibrant matter or new animism, as though appreciation for living nature was incompatible with technological exploitation of nature. But Edison, on the one hand, an explorer of natural resources, who was connected to a company that famously electrocuted animals as a marketing ploy, on the other hand, was committed to a believer in a form of vibrant matter. In a lost chapter of his diary, he argued that our bodies are made up of myriad units of life, and indeed all living things are composed of what amounts to mind-matter monads. Think Leibniz, which Edison suggested come together in swarms to produce conscious multicellular beings. Moreover, these other life units are neither created nor destroyed, and they possess memory and agency. As he put it elsewhere, "I do not believe that matter is inert, acted on by an outside force. To me, it seems that every atom is possessed by a certain amount of primitive intelligence." Edison is here endorsing a very literal notion of vibrant matter. It was this monism that he suggested had convinced him of the very possibility of ghostly survivals. He also Yeah, I can talk about monism later, but I'll skip that. He was also a member of the Theosophical Society, which those of you are likely to know of, but a new religious movement founded in 1875 in New York under the leadership of Helena Batsky and Henry Steele Alcott. The striking thing is that Edison joined it in 3 years after it was founded, making him the 162nd official member of the organization, to some that would grow to at least 45,000 in the ensuing decades. Not only that, he wasn't overly active as a member, but he met with Alcott, one of the founders. And according to Alcott's diaries, they discussed occult forces, the reality of telekinesis, and other paranormal issues. Edison also had one of his assistants record Helena Blavatsky on an early phonographic disc, which unfortunately has become damaged and is now unlistenable. In summary, in the very year in which Edison was inventing the Edison bulb, he was actually deeply engaged in theosophy and occult, or at least psychical research. And before we move off of Edison and rationalities, we're noting that even in his own day, he was given the epithet the Wizard of Menlo Park, which first appeared in press in 1878. I don't want to read too much into the title. It's a metaphor, but it does capture something significant. Edison had a certain capacity for what we could call autohagiography. As several of Edison's biographers have noted, he was a relentless self-promoter and mythologizer. He claimed to have personally discovered things that his technicians actually did. He gave misleading interviews, which he invented anecdotes for the purposes of self-aggrandizement. To be sure, his public relations campaign produced what could be described as a secular apotheosis, but his self-mythologizing was constructed not to babble some colonized people, but the Americans who might purchase his products. But Edison wasn't alone. Actually, if we look at the history of the West, there are many theologies of electricity. To begin, well, I could give you a lot of quotes here, but basically, I'll pick some highlights here. Well, okay, so according to the F.C. Oettinger in 1765, darkness was on the dip and God created light. First, what was this light? And what was it after the creation of light of the sun? It became electrical fire. That's a Western source. Now, B. Brown, electricity is uncreated matter, and the deity himself could not have created the world but for its original eternal presence. Robert Hare, who was a famous inventor in his own right, spirits are electrical conductors whose attracting points bend downward as well as upward, dispensing equally thought and strength to their harmonious fellows. Then we have other figures like John Murray Spear, the one-time Universalist minister who built a mechanical messiah he termed the new motive power, and argued that between the grand central mind and all inferior minds, there exists blah, 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 an electrical chain. And we could go into a lot more detail. Alice Bailey, one of the founders of Theosophy, or later significant figure and leader of Theosophy. All psychical phenomena, as we understand them, have an electrical origin and initial vibration on the first subplane of the physical plane. And then later, not long after Edison was dead, a Canadian medium claimed that Edison had channeled to him the following statement: "The chair upon which you are sitting is nothing but a series of atomic and electronic pulsations. To you, it is solid matter. In reality, is a series of electronic. All matter is really a series of electronic pulsations." This Canadian medium also said that Edison had become his special spirit guide, and he supposedly told Lacey that the internal combustion engine would be replaced by electric cars, based on a particular product, that invention that Edison had made in the spirit world, but had lost before his death, which Lacey tried to build and totally didn't work. But electric cars are now a thing. Okay, so even today, celebrity American psychic medium Willow Siebert claims to be able to channel the collective energy of great souls, including Thomas Edison and Marie Curie. So while it's much less mainstream than Japanese Shinto, we can at least find echoes of a ghostly even Edison in the United States. Now, in the last act of this talk, I want to take these threads together and get even weirder. So, in 2006, a movie titled The Laws of Eternity, Ein no Ho, came out and was promoted by a new religious movement known as Kofuku no Kagaku, that we will talk about in a moment. But the striking thing about this anime is that it opens with a protagonist traveling to New York City, where he goes to a supposed Thomas Edison museum. There, he reads a newspaper article that describes Thomas Edison's efforts to build a spirit phone, and the protagonist of the anime decides to build one himself. He does so, although he discovers that the true spirit phone is as much a product of visionary meditation, it's not a physical artifact, and he and his friends travel through layers of reality to describe basically what the new religious movement thinks is real before they ultimately meet Thomas Edison himself, enshrined as a divine being. Along the way, they actually have a fight with Nietzsche in hell, but they have to join angels and form a battle mech to do so. It's weird. It's kind of incoherent. It's not a very good movie. It's very preachy. But to explain where it comes from, by way of background, according to the group's official count, Happy Science, Kofuku no Kagaku, which is also a gesture to Nietzsche's Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, was founded in 1981 when a Japanese college graduate, Nakagawa Takashi, had an unusual experience in which he sensed an invisible presence that needed to communicate with him with automatic writing. The presence revealed itself to be the 13th century Buddhist monk Nikko. He exchanged automatic writing and spiritual communications first with Nikko, but then he scaled up to include the Buddha, Jesus, Socrates, Nostradamus, and then he went on to Maggie Thatcher and Freddie Mercury. I love that last anecdote, Queen. But anyway, ultimately, he discovered the supreme deity was speaking through him, a deity who revealed that its name was El Cantare. He sings in Spanish. Nakagawa formed a small study group to discuss these and to research human happiness. And he emphasized the scientific, kagaku, nature of his movement and its connection to a lost spiritual technologies of Atlantis, Mu, and various ancient aliens that he claimed also to be able to channel. By 1991, Nakagawa had renamed himself Okawa Ryuho and was claiming not to have just channeled folks, but to be an actual incarnation of El Cantare. And his organized membership continued growing. Two of his books, The Great Warnings of Allah, Ara no Daikekoku, and The Terrifying Revelations of Nostradamus, Nosotodramasu Senritsu no Keiji, had become Japanese bestsellers. Although there's some evidence that the group's membership declined or peaked in the 90s, it still seems to exist, and they have formed a political party that has had some small electoral success. Okawa himself appears in the movie as an incarnation of the eternal Buddha, or Buddha of infinite light, who is also identified with the Christian God, who is also revealed was originally born in Atlantis as the god Thoth, who has been repeatedly reborn in different epochs as Thoth, Hermes, Orpheus, Jesus, and the historical Buddha. There's also a weird scene in the movie which suggests that Atlantis is maybe the true world and our real world is a pale reflection of real events in Atlantis. But in any case, the penultimate god before the ultimate god is in this movie identified with Thomas Edison, who is described as the god of science, Kagaku no Kami, who is also a penultimate Buddha, whose incarnation in the form of various scientific figures has been part of an attempt to lead humanity on a spiritual and scientific progress back to what we lost from Atlantis. This is the Edison in the movie, is saying just as religions that denied science that went extinct, there's no future for science that denies the spirit world. So we have another deified Edison in anime form. Okay, that's a lot of Edisons. What does this tell us? Okay. So I want to give one last apotheosis. I have too many examples in this talk. I know I have a problem with that, but one of the earliest apotheoses about which we have significant evidence in Japan was this one. A historical figure named Sugawara no Michizane, who was a prominent poet and a politician who ran afoul of the imperial court and died in exile. After his death, plague befell the imperial family, and the imperial palace was repeatedly struck by lightning. A local spirit medium told the emperor that these calamities had been caused by Michizane, who had become what was called a goryo, or wrathful spirit. The medium suggested that Michizane could be pacified only if he was deified. So he was ritually transformed or recognized as the deity Tenjin, a kind of god of scholars, and given regular offerings. And even today, people pray to him for luck at college entrance exams. What the example of Michizane tells us is that apotheosis, at least in Japan, is not necessarily reverence, but can be a way of domesticating or placating hostile entities. We have many examples of this in the Japanese context. In this respect, Edison's deification is actually a kind of ambivalence. It's not merely or primarily necessarily worshipful idealization, but a transformation that appropriates his reputation and harnesses his very symbolic powers and the power of electricity and the light bulb as a symbol to the benefit of Japanese corporate leaders. Apotheosis is how you tame demons. So perhaps if Captain Cook was in fact deified, this may have been domesticating his wrathful spirit rather than praising him, although it's a different cultural context that I am not an expert in. But all that is to say, at least in Japan, deification can be as much about appropriating power as worshiping it. I think this is how I understand. So I always have I put everything on this slide. It's too much, but a threefold apotheosis of Edison tells us deification can be a product of practical rationality. Two, Edison mythologized himself, and both Americans and Japanese bought into the mythologization in distinctive ways, but they both mythologized him. Unlike Obiseka, we now have a plethora of accounts of deification of people, often by indigenous actors enmeshed in systems of colonial domination, like the deification of Prince Philip in the Pacific South. Four, often these are deifications as co-opting or domesticating the power of wrathful figures. There's some evidence, perhaps generalizable, that apotheosis can tame demons in different cultural contexts. Five, of all this provides evidence that there's not a vast gulf between Japanese and Euro-American rationalities. I could talk about that more. But treating certain experiences, visions, automatic writing, prophetic gifts, and ecstatic trances, as possibly true allows followers of specific gods to adapt them to fill new needs, or spirits to adapt new needs, both in a Euro-American and in a Japanese context. This also tells us something about religion and science. There's often a myth that religion and science are in conflict. This is a story about Darwin versus Christianity, or the Catholic Church's suppression of Galileo. I lost a page of my notes, but I'll read it from here. Suppression of Catholic Church suppression of science in the Dark Ages. Turns out this is a myth. No serious scholars of the history of religion and science think this is serious, but it kind of functions like a zombie that we have to keep beating up. Most of us in the field think this is dead, but folks outside of the field often think religion and science are necessarily in conflict. Most of us historians of religion and science say, yes, there are occasional moments of conflict, but in general, it's much more complex than that, and science and religion have as often synergized as they have been in conflict. And it also notes that the conflict is often promoted by specific religious leaders. Moreover, there's a long history of movements that we might call religions of science. These are things that declared themselves scientific religions, like Kofuku no Kagaku, or in the West, European groups known as the Monist Leagues, or certain versions of the Theosophical Society itself. We could talk about that more, or if you want in more details. Moreover, new technology does not necessarily diminish religion, but can actually fuel new religious movements. There's another point I want to approach. I've been working to subvert here the classical opposition between a animist past and a technological future. The abyssal line fails geographically, and I've been arguing animism was never truly absent from the theory's heartland and was indeed merely the underside of modernization theory itself. Animism and modernism therefore function as complementary options of a common package. In Japan, one can find flash drives that double as magical charms, funeral rituals for old photographs, and discarded electronics, iPhone apps for automatic exorcism or fortune telling, and Kompira, the so-called god of sailors, now oversees the launch of satellites. But it is not just Japan alone. In study after study, scholars have charted not only traditional but modern forms of magic, including internet-based Haitian voodoo, clairvoyant Brazilian spirit surgeons, Vietnamese divinities that prefer cans of Coca-Cola, aerosol sprays that invoke the protection of Santísima Muerte in Mexico, and a notorious pair of demonically possessed underpants in Ghana. It would seem that all over the globe we have technological and animist modernities encountering each other. And moreover, Japanese technology, this is also true if you look at a survey survey data, which I rehearse in my second book. Combing through the survey data, and I didn't emphasize this so much in the book, but something like 83% of US Americans believe in guardian angels, demons, or ghosts. 83% of Americans. I'm using, uh, um, yeah, I'm combining two surveys. There's some error margin, but this is a 2010 survey. But at least it would seem that the majority of Americans believe in some kind of spirit medium. What is more, Japanese animism is also our animism, insofar as many of the companies and products we import from Japan were themselves associated with either Shinto or Buddhist technological artifacts. Perhaps most famously, the Japanese company, which you Americans likely call the Canon Camera Company, was founded in Japan as the Canon, which means the Bodhisattva of Compassion Camera Company. Canon, also known in Chinese as Guanyin, was the original logo of the Canon Company. And indeed, the company continues to bear some connection to Buddhism, and they would perform Buddhist rituals for old photographs, so that you could send them back to Canon, and they would burn away your old photos to release the karma with special Buddhist priests who did rituals in a broadly Shingon tradition at the site. But that's not the only one. Many of our products that we borrow from Japan have gestures to these technologies in them. For instance, also the Subaru car company. I used to drive a Subaru. I don't anymore. But Subaru comes from Subarachi, which is sort of splendid. But it evokes the Pleiades, which were seen as stellar deities and associated with Shinto tradition in particular. And indeed, Subaru had a history of manufacturing fighter jet parts, part of an ultranationalist Shinto campaign during the Second World War. They've severed their connection to Shinto in ensuing decades. It's mostly a brand thing, but a number of Japanese companies continue to maintain a connection with spiritual technologies, including that's a current Buddhist temple where there's a robot that preaches Buddhist scriptures. Okay. Finally, here's where I want to end the talk. On the one hand, modernity included its own enemy in the form of a backward superstition. As I've argued elsewhere, this notion of superstition can be seen as the legacy of an imagined paganism that provided a quasi-scientific rationale for excluding the old rhetorical enemies of Christian civilization, demons, spirits, and magic, which were now in some respects being labeled as non-existent. This kind of disenchantment is likely to be familiar to folks in a lot of different environments. But there's an additional wrinkle to this narrative because modernity as a project brought with it notions of spirits and invisible forces. Ghosts were globalized. Science and seance were entwined in the spread of science to most of the world. Spiritualisms and animisms were promoted as antidotes to the very ills that modernization was generating. In that respect, colonization and modernization often went hand in hand with mesmerism and spiritualism. Taken all together, we might say that modernization was both disenchanting and enchanting. Some spirits were banished. Demons whose existence were often denied. Those deities that did not apotheosize themselves into gods were often declared superstitious and non-existent. All that is to say, the Japanese novelist Tanizaki Junichiro reminds us in a famous work, In Praise of Shadows, that for all its advantages, the adoption of mass illumination also contributed to partially banishing a shadowy world once populated with demons and monsters. To build on Tanizaki, he's only partially right, but I would agree that the glimmering gods rose at the expense of dark deities. So for every figure deified in the electric age, others were lost. Thanks. If you have any more questions, I should be at 8 o'clock, or okay, 2 minutes past. You can email me or find me in various internet forums. My next book forthcoming is actually about philosophy, not this stuff, but I'm working on this as a book manuscript. I should have a little bit of time to answer questions, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Um, oh gosh, I have a billion things to say. And this is my offer from Tinjin. So I bought this in Kyoto. So I can have the so I have the God of Scholars with me. So you and I can talk on a different subject. I actually worked on some of the figures that you've mentioned, both in connection with Nichiren, and I really want to highlight Swedenborg's connection to early electrical theory, not just in Oettinger, but also actually in French electrical theory. Really came drew a lot from Swedenborg. Okay, so I won't. So I will hold that at some other point.
So I
By
hope we'll
the
get
way,
to chat about that later. I'm yeah writing up some of this stuff now, and I look forward to maybe we can have another chat. And I'd love to cite you in ways that you've written about this stuff too. But yeah, let's
well,
keep talking.
but what I was going to say also is I've worked on Germanic interpretations of the Zeppelin, which religious interpretations of the Zeppelin, and I'm going to talk about that next year. So I will invite you to come back and listen to that one. And my article about the Zeppelin as a divine figure will come out as well. But in that time, so let's go to anyone who has questions.